Tell me, does this sound familiar? Boys shouldn't be wearing makeup or dresses, or no, you shouldn't be wearing that, you look too much like a guy, towards little girls. Have you ever wondered why? Why are people saying these things towards other people? Why are we setting these standards for clothing? Has it always been this way? Well, throughout history, it's very apparent that it's not been, or at least different from how we perceive it today. The idea of how we think clothes are for certain genders today was even different recently. And if you're willing, I'm going to show you examples of unisex clothing and gender fluidity throughout different stages of history all over the world, all the way to modern day. So, for us to begin, let's discuss certain times in history in which there was a unisex pattern of clothing between both the men and women. If you're looking for such examples, let's look all the way back to ancient Egypt in the Old Kingdom. Pictured here is a type of fashion very typical of men and women during that time. They would be wearing short skirts known as kilts or linen from the hips to the waist down that was tied with a sash. These are very common among the lower classes since that's all they could really afford, and it was practical for the work that he did, whether it be farming or washing clothes in the Nile River. Now the higher classes though, they had the luxury of affording intricate trinkets such as amulets, beads, any form of jewelry, along with other cosmetics such as eye makeup. They would adorn themselves with a material called kohl as in K-O-H-L, and they would use it to block out the sun in their eyes by rubbing it in right there. This is typical of how they would distinguish themselves between the lower classes since they could afford it. Now if you want other examples of unisex clothing, let's look no further than ancient Greece. In that time, they would be wearing a piece of clothing known as a tunic, made out of wool and was typically rectangular shaped. This tunic could be worn by both men and women, and the only distinguishing features between the two was the name and how they adorned themselves with it. Men would be called a chiton, and it would be draped over either both or one of their shoulders. It would be made of a light wool material because they worked out in the fields or on horseback or whatever they may be doing outside, and so it has to be a more comfortable material. The women, since they were typically staying indoors more often, they got to wear a more heavily dressed wool linen known as a pepslo. And before I get into the more modern era of unisex clothing, let's discuss something else. How has gendered norms been different throughout history? So, as I just mentioned, we're going to look at some examples in which the gendered norms were quite different from how we have them today. For example, many people would say that heels is a womanly item, a very feminine accessory. But if you look back in the past, we can see that it was very much the opposite of that. In fact, it used to not even be for fashion. It was for horseback riding. In the 10th century of Persia, soldiers would be adorned with these high-heeled shoes that would allow them to more easily stay up on the stirrups of their saddles. It would clip into the middle part of the shoe and the heel, which allowed them to stay on easier. Now, later on in the 17th century, it became a sort of symbol of military power, since only the more wealthier of their folk could afford horses, and thus they would be wearing heels as a sign that they owned horses, they were rich and powerful. And so when Persians sent ambassadors to represent themselves in Europe along Russia, Germany, and Spain, the aristocrats went crazy over this heel phenomenon because they were very much into accessorizing and showing off their wealth of power. And so the men adopted these heels to make themselves feel more powerful by not only being taller, but for making themselves more ornate and decorated. Look no further than King Louis XIV, who made a whole law designating how you were to adorn your heels as a man, and what color you were allowed to wear to represent your courtship with the king. If you were in good courtship with him, he would allow you to wear red heels, pictured here. And of course, it was an issue regarding why. Why did this suddenly become a woman's item, for example? Well, the reason why it became a woman's item was no later than the 18th century. In the 18th century, it was very common for men to be wearing it, but as the decades went on, it became more accustomed to a womanly item because they would make them skinnier and make them more ornate. And so the men at the time, they started to drive away from the heels because they thought, ah, now it's becoming a woman's item. I can't wear this anymore. Bit dramatic, don't you think? So, I just discussed some examples of unisex clothing within history, as long with differing standards of clothing within history. But let's move on into how we got to where we are today. How did we arrive at the conclusion that dresses and pink is for girls and very much shorts or suits are blue for boys? Well, that all started in the 1900s. In the 1920s, that's when they started establishing that you need to assign a sort of style to your babies, that way they're more identifiable in the public. However, it wasn't yet a set standard yet. Most of it was based on what retailers would suggest at the time. And sometimes it would even be based on gender. Some stores, for example in Time magazines during the 1920s, they would recommend that you would get blue for brunettes, for example, instead of just for any gender. But then we started receiving the standard that we have today during the 1940s, in which, well, nationwide, it was a agreed statement that, oh, it shall be blue for boys and pink for girls. But just a few years before that, it was pink for boys and blue for girls, simply because they thought that pink was a more fierce color and blue was a more frilly and dainty color. More examples of gender fluidity in just a very short span of time. But with the rise of 1940s standards for kids being grown up in that styles, baby boomers were then just accustomed to these traditions. They just thought, okay, so this is how it's going to be. Babies are going to be pink in girls and blue in boys. I keep repeating that because that's important. That's what they thought it was. That's what they grew up on. And that's a key factor here. Most gender stereotypes or gender norms are established through what's common in society at the time. Remember how I mentioned that Egyptians would wear linen kilts that were very much common for the lower classes and as well as their working classes? That's just the norm because, hey, that's what worked for them. And back in the 1700s, I mentioned how aristocrats in the Victorian era would be wearing very frou-frou and eccentric clothing, including heels, because, hey, that was just the standards. Over and over again, these whole gender stereotypes are occurring because of just the standards and what society deems as okay at the time. It's not really a set standard of rules. Like, for example, the 1980s, a few decades later, we had all kinds of rock stars presenting themselves in very gender fluid and opposite clothing. Take, for example, David Bowie, who was almost always adorned with heels on himself and wearing very elaborate and feminine makeup in his music videos. Or take Freddie Mercury as another example, who dressed up in full drag for some of his music videos and was very common and feminine in the way he dressed and presented himself. And why not the Beatles, for example? They brought back the idea of men wearing heels for a short period of time when they would present themselves with their Cuban-style heel boots. But of course, that was the 80s, and eventually that too faded with some time, but it's still present in today's standards. Speaking of today's standards, let's talk about why it's important that we establish a more gender-neutral identity towards clothing and how it affects certain people. So, as I just mentioned, how does this affect today's standards? Why should we care about how we dress each other up or how we present ourselves to the world? Well, that's the thing though. Clothing as a whole is a way of representing who we are as a person. Throughout history, they usually used it for class or social standing as saying, oh, I'm higher above you. But in today's standards, that's not what we do it for. We do it because we're representing what makes us feel comfortable, what makes us feel ourselves. And if there's any community out there that's more open about being who they are, about gender fluidity, and being the person that they want to take pride in, look no further than the LGBTQ youth. Throughout the entire community, a lot of people are very fluid in the way they dress, whether it be non-binary, being very androgynous, or not really conforming to any sort of gender identity, or just in general, more gay men wearing makeup more often, or dressing up in drag, or the like. But here's the thing though. Not many people, especially the younger people of today's generation, are allowed to freely express themselves in this clothing. Since a lot of older generations grew up with the idea that there is a specific standard for clothing, that every girl must wear this and every boy must wear that, they're still instilled with the ideals that if you don't conform to those standards, you're wrong, you're bad. Take it from what some of my friends have said regarding how they feel about clothing. Many of them say it's a form of self-expression for themselves, that this is who they are and that this is the way they can represent themselves. But many have told me how that they've said that they aren't allowed to be freely expressive of themselves, that their own parents would ridicule them because they want to wear more masculine clothing like suits and ties. And so a lot of people will grow up in fear of taking pride in who they are simply because many older generations will point to them being in the wrong, that they're mistaken. And that shouldn't be how we're teaching kids today. Like I mentioned before, the whole idea of gendered norms is based around a society's standards. Why should our society's standards be lowered to restrictions, to boundaries? We are coming closer and closer to a more open-minded society every day, and so shouldn't the way we present ourselves be reflective of that? Isn't our clothing, our makeup, our accessories a outward expression of who we are? So why limit that? Why tell people that the way they dress is the wrong way? Thank you for listening today, and I hope you may have learned a lesson or two about clothing and what it means to express yourself. Thank you, and have a wonderful day.